Okay. Nope, I'm not good. Any better? No. Okay, there we go. Okay. So is that loud enough?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Recording?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Okay, so just to take a few minutes now, hopefully you've got one of these study guides. If not, there's some on a chair in the back of the room there by the double doors as you go out. You can pick one up as you go. So we'll just take a few minutes to kind of summarize some of the thoughts there. As we look at this, we started with examining science. What is the difference between observational science and historical science? You remember that was from the beginning of the video. The difference between observational science and historical science.
Observational is testable and repeatable.
Yeah, so observational science is testable and repeatable. We can see that. We can look at that. Historical science is all about the past. You're trying to make a good narrative, a good explanation of how you think things happen, but you can't test it, you can't verify it, you can't repeat it. Did the description of evolutionary theory as history surprise you? Did that surprise you at all?
No.
No? You guys are just like, yeah, we know that.
It did surprise me. Yeah.
Thank you for being honest, Wade. Everybody's going, yeah, I was well aware of that. Thank you. I think that's a very helpful distinction.
Well, I would say that the surprise is that for years it's been taught as scientific fact.
Yes, it is.
Not as theory.
Yeah. Yeah, now you have to be a little careful, if you tell your friends, well, that's just a theory, we use that in why did the skunk come into my neighbor's yard and not my yard? We have a theory it likes the cat food over there better. But when you say scientific theory, that's a much more heavy statement. It means that we think this is true until maybe something comes along to disprove. So be a little careful throwing that word around. But yes, it's been taught as fact for decades and decades and decades. And that's why for most people who live in this country, it's like, well, why would I even question that? It's obvious. All my teachers have taught it. So they don't even think about that. So how is this helpful when we compare evolutionary theory to observational science? When you think about that, how is that helpful? Knowing that evolution is a historical science, not observational.
I think it just proves the Bible right.
Okay, so it helps understand the Bible better, prove it right.
Because it was
Paul?
written a long time ago.
Okay.
In fact,
Okay, Paul? Right. Wayne?
I have the same thought. That's history, and it's observational, but the other one is not. It's just a theory.
Yeah, so
It's not a good one.
both of them are historical, right? You can't prove, like the resurrection, we have no video of Jesus' tomb opening up. We don't have it. So you can't prove. It's also historical. So when we get toward the end of the video, if we have time in our discussion next week, we'll talk about that. So if you can't prove either of them, then what is most credible? And that's where you start to see it. And by the way, I'll just put in a plug for Fit for Life. We do that class every fall and every spring. We talk about why you can look at the Bible and say, is it reliable or not? And then find out, yes, it actually is. The manuscript evidence and so on is very compelling compared to other books. All people have the same evidence before them, but we approach science with a worldview, a mindset. How does that help when talking with others or reading information? Because I know a number of Christians get very upset. It's hard to talk to someone about Jesus when you're upset. That believe in Jesus. Don't be stupid, right? That's not very good witnessing, is it? So how does this understanding of a mindset or a worldview, how can that be helpful when you think about witnessing to others or just reading some of the material? Becky?
Well, there can be a discussion of, well, this is how I saw this video and it's presented. There's historical and there's observational, and you can say that whole idea of not adding DNA, not being able to add it to change, is such a huge piece of information that you can.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, even science is turning. There are more and more scientists who are coming around to the creation view.
Yeah, that's good to hear. Yeah. So yeah, the evidence is pretty overwhelming. Where I'm going with this question is, if you're talking with a friend or maybe a classmate, you know, they've been given a worldview, and hopefully that helps us to be patient and kind, because all of us think weird things sometimes, don't we? We have weird worldviews, weird views. That's a good way to say it. We have weird views that others would look at and say, you know, what are you smoking? So when you talk to someone who's been born and raised for 30, 40, 50, 60 years of evolution's fact, evolution's fact, evolution's fact, instead of getting angry, you can say, okay, I think I understand where you're coming from. Can I just suggest a couple of thoughts? And we can talk later. Because you're not going to sit down with someone in a cafeteria or at a restaurant and in 20 minutes change their mind when they've heard it for 50 years. It's not going to happen. Because part of our identity is wrapped up in our worldview. So I hope that was the idea of that question. Okay, the second section, and these again are in your study guide, is biology. What is the difference between macro and microevolution? Paula.
Microevolution is just the reshuffling of genetic information to allow an organism to adapt to its environment. But macroevolution is actually assuming that new genetic information is being created so that, you know, let's say a species can adapt to the point where it turns into another species.
Right. Very good answer. So microevolution is very small changes in an organism that allow it to adapt to its environment. And Darwin's Galapagos finches, remember that was how the size of the beak was different? Did you know that it changed like 100 years later, went back small again, now they're larger again? So that's adaptation within a species. But it's not a new species. There's no genetic information added, as Becky pointed out, to where a dog becomes a cat. Or the popular theory today is that dinosaurs became birds. And to go from lizard skin, which is one connected piece, to bird skin, which is individual cells that have feathers in them. That's how the feather quills go in, one individual cell. You're going from a skin that's a one piece, that's why it can be shed for reptiles, snakes, and lizards, to a bird that has individual cells. The amount of genetic information you have to add to go from dinosaur to bird is incredibly high. And when we don't see any mutations or reproduction, dumping in, you'd have to dump in millions of bits of genetic information into the DNA to make that happen. It's not observable. It doesn't happen. And that's very solid. And I just kind of answered the second question then. Why is the addition of massive amounts of genetic information such a problem for macroevolution? Because it doesn't happen. There's no observable process that we can look at and say, that's where all that new genetic information is being added.
And with all the science going on, they can't even engineer that now. And so if you try to do that as a scientist, you can't.
Well, they can, but they do it by doing hybridization. But you're taking information from another organism and you're dumping it in. And so who does that?
It's still geneticists.
Geneticists. And what do geneticists have in their craniums? Brains. I'm serious. They have intelligence. So an intelligence is operating upon an organism to add information to it. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Read Genesis 1.
They're not creating information, they are adding existing information from a different
They're not
location.
even creating it. Yeah, they're, what's the old joke? Satan says to Jesus, you know, humans are such a mess. You did a lousy job of making these. I can make a better one myself. And Jesus says, fine, go ahead and show me. And so Satan starts walking over, and he gets a shovel and he starts digging. And Jesus goes, what are you doing? He says, well, I'm getting some dust of the earth so I can make a human. And Jesus says, make your own dirt. What did you learn from the examples of the dog breeds? We're talking genetics here. What's that?
Does it come from wolves?
It actually does come from wolves.
Yeah.
In fact, scientists have proven that every dog on the planet is descended from a wolf-like ancestor through mitochondrial DNA. That sounds like a tree branching out, doesn't it? Very interesting. Gene?
That it's micro.
Microevolution, not macro. Right.
That the refinement of a particular breed is due to the loss of information, not the gain of information.
That's so important to understand that the refinement of a particular breed, like they use a Chihuahua, is due to the loss of genetic information, not the addition.
So that Chihuahua can never go back to
That
wolf.
Chihuahua can never go back
But
to being
they
a
can
wolf.
take a wolf and make it into a Chihuahua,
Poor
start all
wolf.
over.
Loses a lot in the process.
It loses a ton, yeah.
Including its self-esteem.
That's so true. They have such sad eyes. Look what they did to me. How about another very commonly given example? Are mutations in bacteria examples of macroevolution? Why not? Are mutations in bacteria examples of macroevolution? Becky?
No, because they're still operating within the given DNA that they have. They're not adding any new DNA.
Right, so again, very simple answers, very good science. The bacteria are only operating within the DNA they have, and they have some kind of mutation, and they become less functional. They're partially disabled, and that's why what's supposed to happen when you ingest an antibiotic, it goes into your bloodstream, and these, of course, tiny little particles. The bacteria ingests them as food, and when the digestion process occurs, an enzyme is released, and it's supposed to kill the bacteria. It usually works very well. But there are some bacteria that have lost the ability to digest that particular antibiotic in your bloodstream. And so they try to ingest it and they can't digest it. And so it remains inert. So all the other bacteria in your body die, and these are the ones left over. They go, hey, those nice apartments across town are open. We're moving in. And so they can reproduce and multiply because they've gained immunity from the antibiotic, not because they've added genetic information, but because they're actually a little bit disabled and they can't interact with that antibiotic like a healthy bacteria would. And if you put them back in a normal environment with lots of other bacteria, the other bacteria outcompete them and they die off. And by the way, the same is true when, they didn't use this here, but the same is true for insects and pesticides. See, that proves evolution. Those insects are resistant now to that pesticide. It's the same thing. These insects are somewhat defective, and they have lost the genetic information necessary for being killed by that pesticide. So it's not adding information, it's losing. And as long as you keep that concept in mind, it really helps a lot. A couple of thoughts there toward the end of that little section. Harmful mutations vastly outnumber beneficial mutations. And then this genetic entropy is a serious problem for evolutionary thinking. When I watch this, when I previewed the video, it's kind of disturbing and discouraging, isn't it? We're all getting worse and worse. Every day we're getting worser and worser. That's what's happening.
Law of Thermodynamics.
It is, yeah. The second law of thermodynamics is that the universe is in a state of decay and things are falling apart, and it's true. That's actually what's happening. And it's happening to us as well. So you think about how could people live so long, in Genesis, 600 years, 900 years. Well, they were vastly superior to us in probably every way. Physically, mentally, they could run circles around us doing algebra. That's why you read in Genesis, these people invented all kinds of different arts and sciences because they were brilliant. They'd be mega geniuses today. And we see someone like that every once in a while that can really think, or an athlete who can really be amazing. Can't hold a candle to people from thousands of years ago. They were vastly superior to us. And in the end, humanity's, thank God for Jesus, otherwise we'd be in trouble. Now, finally, our last question. Have you seen an exhibit featuring Lucy before? If so, what did the display look like and what did it convey? Anybody see one? Anybody been in a museum? Nobody?
I haven't been to a museum.
The youth group that went to youth gathering saw it, Ella saw it, and then
Okay.
museum in Houston.
So a museum in Houston. I went to school at the seminary in St. Louis. The St. Louis Zoo has a Lucy exhibit. I grew up in Seattle. There's one up there. Now, so you've never seen one, but the photos you saw in the video are very accurate. They basically take a chimpanzee, stand her up. Some of them give her human breasts. And some of the exhibits have put blue eyes in the mannequin, even though no apes have blue eyes. The hands of Lucy in the exhibits, like at the St. Louis Zoo or Seattle, the bones are straight. Now, one of the other answers in Genesis videos we watched here some years ago, the author of that talked about. I wasn't even going with my slides here.
No, you weren't.
You got to remind me, dude.
I do?
You do.
Okay. Go through your slides.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Appreciate that. So one of the scientists, Christian scientists in that video asked the person who had put this together, said, but I went to see that Lucy exhibit, and her hands are human hands. That's the other thing you'll see. They're very human hands. And he says, but the bones that were found with Lucy were curved like tree-dwelling apes. He goes, oh, I know that, but we wanted to give the idea of how evolution works. So it's not even accurate to the bones that were found. It's accurate to the narrative, which, as we learned today, is an historical narrative. This is what we think happened, not observed. And so a lot of people have said, oh, yeah, Lucy's proof. But as we saw today, that's not good science. And I love how in this video they quote evolutionary scientists, not Christians, who are saying, yeah, we don't think that's a true taxon, a species, an example of a species. We think it's a jumble of bones. And these are evolutionary scientists saying that, not creation scientists. So I think this is very helpful for Christians, for us to go, wait a minute, it's not fact like we've been told all our lives. And that's important. I'll get to you just a minute. It's important because let me ask you this. What does evolution do with death? What is death in evolutionary thought?
Dead.
What does death accomplish?
Nothing.
No, it accomplishes something.
Oh.
No. Gretchen.
Well, school teaches us that death accomplishes we basically die and then we break down for more plants, more animals to live and feed off of our disposed.
That's pleasant. Yeah. So I may not be saying the question correctly. What does death do for a species? Paula.
It gets rid of the not
The weaker
things,
ones.
the weaker, and so it makes the species
Makes
stronger.
the species better. Natural selection. So in evolution, death is a good thing. Weeds out the weak, and then the species gets stronger. What does that say? What does the Bible say death is? The wages of sin is?
Yeah.
And so when you look at creation, you see Adam and Eve sinning, and death enters the world. Evolution says, no, death existed for billions of years, or at least hundreds of millions of years, before Adam and Eve, if they existed, came into being. And so death isn't a bad thing, it's actually a good thing. So totally opposite ways. Anna, and then we got to close.
I was just going to bring up the term unbounded extrapolation in reference to Lucy. I love that term because I think that is seriously a way that we as Christians can look at information.
Yes.
And because there is always extrapolation, many times amongst fossils or when they're analyzing remains, but if it's unbounded, like they had such a huge area they were.
Yeah.
I love that term, unbounded.
Yeah, so Anna pointed out the term unbounded extrapolation. Because we extrapolate on the basis of what we see, we all do that. But if it's unbounded, if you look at a little change in a dog and you say, well, I'm going to extrapolate that and I'm going to have no bounds, no limits on it, that's how new species begin, then that's not good science. And the other reason that I like the term unbounded extrapolation is because it's just really fun to say. I mean, who doesn't want to say unbounded extrapolation? It's hard. Maybe next week's sermon will be titled Unbounded Extrapolation. Let's close in prayer. Father, we thank and praise you for making us. That means we're loved. It means we have a purpose. It means we have our identity as your children. And it means that you did send Jesus to save us. And we're so grateful.